Good morning. We talked in our introductory section about the ways in which the humanities can inform and contribute to our understanding of some of the conditions, contradictions, and crises, some of the struggles of the present period. And I wanted to give you an example of exactly how that works, exactly how that can be the case, by looking at a text, specifically Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. It is a text which comes from a different context than our own. It's much more recent than many of the things we will look at over the course of the semester. But it is nonetheless, in many ways, from a different time and place. But I want to show you, first of all, how to read that text, what you should be looking for and how to find it, and then delve a little bit into the claims that it's making and the arguments that it's using to support those claims. And that will then, I think, help set the stage for our broader consideration of the way in which the humanities can inform our understanding of what we believe it means to be human, and also how we want to live our lives, what we want to do with our lives, and how we are going to do that. So I'm going to pull up the text here. Hopefully you've all had a chance to read it. And what we're going to do is to read through it together. I'm going to obviously not read the entire thing with you, but focus you in on some key sections. And from there, we will delve into the actual arguments and to the very profound challenge that King presents to us. So the letter is dated the 16th of April, 1963. My fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything else than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. So here we have an introduction. You can pick up from this a number of things. Hopefully you already have some sense of the context of the letter, just based on your general knowledge of the role of Dr. King in the civil rights movement. But nonetheless, focus on what's there in the text. We have a date, which allows you to know during what period of his work you would have to look in order to get some sense of the broader interpretive context of the document. It's written to his fellow clergymen. That's going to be very important in terms of understanding the types of arguments that he makes. He's in the Birmingham City Jail, and again, if you don't know the details of King's history, he was jailed many times for civil disobedience, for nonviolent resistance. And that was the case in Birmingham in April of 1963 as well. He begins here by laying out some of the claims that they're making. So we know that the basic form of the letter is going to be an attempt to discuss and respond to their criticisms. Now, he may ultimately do some other things as well, but that's going to set the basic tone and form. And so we have two of the criticisms presented right here, that his activities are unwise and untimely. We continue on, we get some more. I think I should indicate why I am here in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. Okay, so one of the accusations which was made of King, and it's made of many people who are organizing for social justice, is that they're outside agitators, that they don't have anything to do with the people in the community, that they're just coming in from the outside and making trouble, creating a ruckus. Okay? So that will be an additional question that he will attempt to answer. And then further on down, let's see if we can find it exactly for you here. And the find function is not working very well. The other issue that is identified is that his activities are illegal. He is criticized because his activities are illegal. And so we have four basic objections that he is attempting to address. First, that he's an outside agitator. Second, that the protests are unwise. Third, that they are untimely. And fourth, that they are illegal. So let's look at his response to the charge that he is an outside agitator. He says here, I have the honor of serving as the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South, and one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Frequently, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage in nonviolent direct action if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented. So the first piece of this is that he's part of a national organization which has people in that area, and that he was invited to Birmingham by people in that community. And as we talk over the course of the semester about organizing, one of the things that we will return to is the importance of having some kind of invitation, hopefully a formal invitation from people in the community that you're organizing. One reason for that is so that you can answer the outside agitator charge. But second, it's going to be critical in terms of credentialing you in the community. No matter what kind of other credentials you bring, whether you are an important religious leader like King was, or any of a range of different kinds of credentials that might make you a generally respected person. When you're organizing in a local community, people want to know that somebody there knows you and supports you being there. And that is an important avenue towards building trust. He continues, more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. So his second response then is that there's injustice, and that he is called to denounce injustice, to struggle against injustice, to try to rectify injustice. Third, he says, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. So the other piece is that he is saying that because everything is interconnected, even as an outsider, he has standing. Or perhaps more profoundly, there is no such thing as an outsider. All right, well, let's look at the second of the objections, which is that the protests are untimely. And we're talking here about the protests in Birmingham. He says, you deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I'm sure no one of you would want to rest content with the kind of superficial social analysis which deals merely with effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. And then he gets down to the question of timing. Talks about the steps in the organizing process, collecting facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. He says they went through all of those steps in Birmingham, and he lays out the timeline and says that they tried to negotiate, but the leaders refused to negotiate. They attempted to talk to the business community. There were certain promises made, and they agreed to a moratorium. As the weeks and months went by, though, he says, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. Okay? So they were gearing up for action again, and then it occurred to them that the mayoral election was coming in March, and they decided to postpone action. But when they discovered that Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, had piled up enough votes to be in the runoff, they decided again to postpone action until the day after the runoff so that the demonstrations would not be used to cloud the issues. So basically, he said they waited. But the new mayor who came in was a more gentle person. Some have asked, why didn't you give the new city administration time to act? The only answer I can give to this query is that the new Birmingham administration must be prodded about as much as the outgoing one before it will act. We're sadly mistaken if we feel that the election of Albert Boutwell as mayor will bring the millennium to Birmingham. While he is a gentler person, Mr. Connor, both are segregationists. So that is the second reason. Essentially, he's giving a timeline explaining that, in fact, they did attempt to negotiate. The city did not negotiate in good faith. The business community did not negotiate in good faith. They nonetheless chose to wait, given their analysis of what would be propitious timing. But based on what they understand about the new mayor, if he's going to do anything, it's only going to be under pressure. And you're already getting a sense here of just how much King has gone through and his group of leaders have gone through in order to have the best timing possible, because timing is an important element in political action. And of course, the implication is that his adversaries are not going through anything like the same careful consideration. And so we get here this conclusion. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has always meant never. We must come to see, with one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied. Okay? And then finally, he goes on to one additional argument, situating the struggle of the civil rights movement in the larger context of decolonization. We've waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed towards gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace. So he's situating the civil rights movement in the context of the larger struggle for decolonization. This is important in terms of interpreting King's larger political orientation. He is often regarded, by comparison, for example, to someone like Malcolm X, as a moderate in the civil rights movement, and in many ways he was. But it should be clear that while he has this distinctive, and I would argue actually ultimately questionable commitment to nonviolence, he does in fact see himself as part of the larger national liberation movements, the larger anti-colonial movements, which were shaping the course of history in the post-World War II period. So we get now next to the idea that the protests are unwise. And he has already actually answered one of the arguments there, and that is the idea that they ought to simply negotiate more. And his answer is that they tried negotiation and it didn't work, and that oppressors never yield without pressure. And so we have here this fundamental idea, this really central idea of intentionally creating tension. And we get a good discussion of that in this paragraph, I think. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You're right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue that can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. And so the idea here, very simply, is, you know, the people who are benefiting from segregation, or at least imagine that they're benefiting from it, don't want to change. They're not going to change unless you apply pressure. Okay? And so that is his argument about, his response to the claim that the activities themselves, regardless of timing, are inherently unwise. The third question, or the next question anyway, is the question of the legality of the struggle. And we find him joining that question here in this paragraph. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us to consciously break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. One has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. That's a very important point. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. And so his answer is that there's a higher law. Okay? There is a law of nature, an eternal law, a divine law that transcends human law. And human law is simply a way of interpreting and applying and implementing that higher principle. So for example, to put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. Okay? And then he offers a couple of other angles. This is typical of the type of writing that we see here. in that it is not a formal philosophical treatise where one would expect him to be absolutely rigorously consistent. Instead, it is a rhetorical piece. Its aim is to persuade. And so, you don't like natural law theory? Here's another argument. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. And the second argument. Maybe you don't believe there's a natural law, maybe you don't believe there's an eternal law, but certainly you understand that there's a difference between a person and, my coffee cup here. Right? And that's really perhaps all you need to understand that the segregation statutes are immoral and unjust. And then we get a final attempt here. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation, is not segregation, an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness. Okay? And so there we have his answer to the argument that the protests are illegal and therefore it should not take place. And he goes on, and you can see a further expansion of this. And he gives the example, for example, here, we should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I'm sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. Setting this in a very, very, very stark context. So this really, I think, crystallizes the challenge that King is making to us. It is not simply that we have a right to disobey unjust laws. We have an obligation to disobey them. And exactly what form that disobedience takes, perhaps there may be some merit in applying the principle contextually, but it is nonetheless an authentic obligation. And that then leads to his position here, his argument that he is disappointed with the white moderate. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderates. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' council or the Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. And essentially he's saying that because tension is necessary for change, because the oppressor will not relinquish without pressure, that the white moderate who gets up and says, look, yeah, of course segregation's wrong, but you're going about it the wrong way, are essentially defending segregation, because in fact there will not be change using the methods that they advocate. And specifically, he identifies two tendencies. One is to value order above justice. We've already seen that. And then he also says that they separate the sacred from the social, the body, and the body from the soul. Offer a couple of concluding reflections. First, the challenge, namely, and this is really what the whole letter drives towards, the idea that we have not just a right but an obligation to disobey unjust laws. We have an obligation to struggle against injustice. And that is a major claim that addresses both the current situation, because as we've been talking about the continued police violence, the continued, people sometimes say random murders of innocent Black men, but in fact it would be more accurate to say the systematic and intentional murder against Black men. That's clearly an injustice, and there is an obligation to act. Not just a right, but an obligation, and specifically an obligation to resist laws and to resist other activities which stand in the way of addressing that injustice. That then goes to the broader question of what we believe it means to be human and what we are going to do with our lives. If we have an obligation to struggle against injustice, then a central piece of our calling as human beings is a call to be engaged citizens. And that doesn't just mean law-abiding citizens. It doesn't even just mean someone who participates in elections, who participates in jury service and the other formal obligations of citizenship. It means being someone who devotes a significant, perhaps even defining portion of their life energy towards the struggle against injustice, towards the struggle to build a society which can unleash the full development of human capacities. And then that goes on and frames for us the broader question of what is it that defines us as human? What are those capacities? What are we being called to cultivate, and what capacities are we talking about when we say that we want a society that promotes the full development of human capacities? So what does this have to do with the humanities? Well, we've already seen that we can derive very powerful resources by analyzing and interpreting cultural artifacts. In this case, the artifact is a text. It is King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And in reading it carefully, in understanding it in its historical context, it provides resources for our reflection on what it means to be human, for our reflection on an analysis of the current situation. In fact, it even provides, as we've seen, a model for how one organizes. And we'll see over the course of this semester that other kinds of artifacts can do this as well. Okay? Some of the artifacts we're going to look at are from very remote times and places, and so the connect with the current situation may not always be quite as clear. But when we look at Aboriginal art from Australia, or the Keris origin myth, or the ruins at Göbekli Tepe, we will see a statement there about what it means to be human. Second, we will, in the course of analyzing those artifacts, and then later on in the semester, in the course of looking at some fundamental texts in social theory, deepen our ability to engage in social analysis. We will learn how to pick apart a particular society and understand how it works, or how it doesn't work, how it fails. And we'll learn to look at things like the impact of the ecosystem and the physical terrain, the biological terrain. Look at the impact of technology, of economic structures, of political structures, of people's beliefs and values. And then finally, of course, a lot of the texts that we will look at, especially the philosophical and religious texts, but some of the others as well, will make claims about, direct claims about what it means to be human. And so that in turn will inform our own reflections on what it means to be human. We want to thank you very much. I know this is a longer video than perhaps you're accustomed to, and probably longer than most of the ones will be. But I think that the text in question deserves this level of attention, and I think it deserves attention, this kind of attention, particularly at the beginning of the course. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your reflections in the discussion board.